Welcome to the Productivity Podcast. Delighted today to be joined by Dulcie Swanston. Hi, Dulcie.
Hello. How you doing?
I'm good. Warm. It's a warm one, but I've been looking forward to this one. So delighted that you've joined us. So Dulcie, you're director at T-Break Training and also author of the Not Bloody Rocket Science book, which I've had the privilege of reading.
Oh, great.
Yeah, good read. Read. Some interesting stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Learned a lot, actually. Life and leadership hacks.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be chatting about barriers that get in the way to delivering productivity through people. So we're great at identifying productivity initiatives and timing them and all that stuff, but you've still got to deliver it through people. But before we dive into the meat of the conversation, it'd be good if you could tell us about how you got to writing a book and being the director of T-Break Training.
Okay, cool. Well, before all of that, I spent 23 years, very happy years actually, in corporate life, so working for a FTSE 250, and had loads of different jobs there, including operations, where I was hands-on responsible for 14 direct reports and making people be productive. So I worked in pubs, bars and restaurants. So I did all of that. I only actually came to HR and training in my mid-30s when I'd done lots of different things. And I left the business to set up my own coaching company. When I did executive coaching, quite often my coachees would say to me, do you train this sort of stuff in to teams? And I used to commercially say no and realise that didn't make any sense. So I founded T-Break Training to train in the sort of concepts that I talk to my coachees about, such as productivity, about how our brain gets in the way of us performing and doing things to our best ability. And then people used to say to me, gosh, you should write a book about all this. And so I did. So the sort of subsequent things I did after coaching were a bit on client demand, really. But I suppose that's a good way to build a business as any.
Absolutely. And massive respect to anybody who has the patience, time and ability to write their own book. So, well done. Well done. Great read. So the nugget I take out of that story is you spent a lot of time in pubs.
Yeah. Bob on. Both as a customer. In fact, when I left university, I'd done an English degree, wanted to teach. My mum and dad made it really clear the money had run out by that stage, so I'd have to get a job. And I thought, gosh, what do I know about? And the answer was pubs. So to be fair, I applied at that stage to the only pubco whose closing date hadn't gone. So I don't recommend that to any graduates looking to find a job. But it worked out for me in the end.
Worked out in the end, everybody finds their path in their way, don't they? Even if it's via the pub.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we think about productivity then, and as you know, we do lots of measurement and identify opportunities and area for improvements. That's all great and that's all science and fact-based.
Yeah.
There's then the challenge of how you deliver that, and every organisation requires, however big or small, their people to deliver those productivity gains or levels or targets, however they're badged up.
Yeah.
And I think when we've taught, some of the work you do really plays into that in terms of those barriers and the way our minds work and what things get in the way. So it'd be good to get your thoughts on, even if we've got the right optimum level of productivity, why collectively people struggle to deliver it.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's the thing, isn't it? We know what can be done in a certain amount of time. So we expect that by telling people that that's what can be done in that amount of time, whether it's, pulling pints or serving customers or, anything that we might do at work, we think that people will do it. And the bottom line is that people still need to be motivated to deliver those targets, even if those targets are possible. Does that make sense? So motivation really is the key to making sure that the target that is possible is actually achieved.
And that motivation may be different for different individuals, because what motivates me, I assume, may not motivate you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's been loads of studies done into what motivates people. And as you can imagine, it's like the holy grail, isn't it? That if you manage to put your finger on what it is that motivates people, if there was some sort of magic to it, you'd make yourself a fortune. But basically, motivation can be either intrinsic, which is you do it because you find it gratifying, you want to do it, or it's extrinsic. You do it because something happens as a result of you doing or not doing the thing. So that's your pay and your rations, but it can be a negative one. It could be you don't get fired if you perform to the standard. So intrinsic is anything that's out of us, and intrinsic is anything that's within us. And the interesting thing is that there's been loads of studies done, and the bottom line is that if you just want quantity, if you just want something doing, and it's important how many of them you do, extrinsic motivation works fine. So saying to people, you'll get paid depending on how many times you do the thing, that works fine if quantity is all that matters. But if quality matters, there's lots of research that suggests you cannot get quality with just extrinsic motivation. So pay and rations, telling people what to do, doesn't work if you want quality. It only works if quantity is a thing that matters.
So that there must be a big impact then from leaders in terms of how they, I suppose, lead, or the shadow they cast across their teams to the levels of motivation and therefore productivity they'll achieve.
Oh, massively. And anybody who's worked in leadership or management will have seen this, that some people are able to get people to do things and some people aren't. And, you know, that's the skill of a manager, isn't it, really? That some people who just tell people what to do, they simply can't understand why it doesn't work. But in actual fact, there's lots of really good signs that shows you why it doesn't work, that telling people what to do, it simply doesn't deliver you a quality result. It might deliver you quantity, and people might do it in the short term. So there's some really good research done where they paid people to exercise because they thought, actually, if we pay people to exercise, it will mean that they do it. And actually, it worked for about 6 months. So people will do what they're told for an external reward, but only for a short period of time. So the really great managers, and most of us have had the privilege of working with them, they're the people that understand what it is that's going on for you, that will get you to want to do it of your own volition. So I'm a big fan of helping people to find what it is within their teams that will mean that their team will perform when they are not there. Because that's the trick, that your team are motivated to perform and to be productive when you're not checking in on them all the time. That's the holy grail for me.
It's interesting you say that, because some of the studies we do will look across a week, and 9 out of 10 times I'd say you can tell the manager's day off.
Yeah.
Without me knowing, I can look at the 7 days and say, I think the manager was off that day and that day.
Yeah.
And you see the difference.
And I've seen it the other way around, though, actually, where some managers, you can tell they're on, because actually they act as a demotivating force for the team, unfortunately. So I think, you know, I've seen it cut both ways. I think what's fascinating, and maybe you've seen this as well, is where you can compare and contrast shifts with different leaders on them. So they've both got a leader with similar pay, similar experience on the shift. So it's not that people aren't being managed, it's just they're being managed by somebody with a different style who's maybe not linking into what it is that individual person needs to be motivated. Because motivation is a really personal thing. As you said earlier on, what motivates you won't motivate me. So it's about really understanding the individual to get the most out of them.
There must be some kind of key behaviours that we know are motivating and some that in general terms aren't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's some really obvious ones. So the first one is the telling people what to do and threats. As I've said, they don't really work. They can work in the real short term. And the reason for that is actually neuroscientific. So it's not just that telling people what to do is a hard skill and people just need to get on with it. Our brains just don't work that way. So if somebody tells you how to do something, Simon, what that means is it's not good enough in itself. Your brain has got to work out what that actually means for you. It's in effect got to create its own instruction manual, if you like, in order for you to be able to do it with any sense of, you know, motivation or autonomy is probably a better way of describing it. So if you want somebody to do something autonomously, they've got to create their own instruction manual. So even though you think you've described it clearly, the only instruction manual that matters is the one in our own heads. So telling people what to do simply doesn't work by itself. You've got to give people time to process it. But there's some really what used to be called soft skills, but in my mind, I don't like labeling them like that because they are hard commercial skills because they deliver business results. So things like providing emotional support for people, that's been shown in research to matter in terms of how motivated people are to deliver. Accepting that people learn differently. So actually just showing people what to do might not work for everybody. Some people might need to take away a manual and read it, things like that. Things like active participation. People want choice. People like to feel that they're in control. Some people are motivated by competition. Constructive feedback is a big one. So there's lots of different ways in which we can motivate people. And I think what great leaders do is they hone in on those. So they don't have a tick box and get people to fill it in. They listen to people. They start to understand the individual and they can tweak what they do in order to sort of dial things up and dial things down depending on who they're talking to.
Yeah, it's interesting, that whole being told what to do. And it's a kind of natural reaction. Those barriers come up, don't they? Of, well, you can't tell me what to do, or I've got a better way of doing it. And some of that's the golden nuggets that always lie within of, you may get to the same result, but somebody may have a better way of doing it or more experience or have thought about it differently. It brings me back actually to a time when I worked in DIY, and we did a lot of work on, it was called self-managed teams at the time. We all had to go on a coaching course and kind of digest the Coaching for Performance book by John Whitmore. And it stands the test of time.
It does, absolutely.
That came back to that whole thing that actually self-managed teams, and we probably took it to the nth degree of a bit of abdication, I suspect, but actually empowering people to think within themselves and give them the problem or the statement and say, how do we solve it, rather than say, well, I'm not even going to talk to you about the problem, this is just what we need to solve, gave some amazing results if you had the right people. Now, clearly, if you had the wrong people, it can lead to a massively unproductive environment because
100%.
People can do what they want. So there was a nice balance, but it became, when we got it right, it became self-regulating.
Yeah. No, and you have to be really careful when you, and you've seen it, I think you hinted there. I mean, I don't know the story about the self-managed teams, but it sounds as though it was all right up to a point. And I think that's the issue, that sometimes telling people what to do is the right thing to do in the short term. So there's no doubt that if people have got low levels of a skill and low levels of will, you just need to be really clear and tell people what to do and give them time to process it. I mean, I've got 5 teenagers and I quite often joke that whilst coaching is what I do now, there are some times where I'm just going to tell people what to do and there's no option. It's not for discussion. As you can imagine, it'd be chaos. But I think the trick is to try and make sure that you save telling people what to do when it's a really clear thing. There's no room for discussion whatsoever, and you're going to provide really clear guidance. People aren't going to be required to be autonomous when you're not there. So I think telling people what to do has a place. It's just knowing when to use it. And I'm always really clear about that, because I think otherwise saying that it's not got a place ever is a bit misleading. I use a classic marketing 2x2. If any of your listeners did marketing, the BCG matrix, where you kind of draw skill and will on both sides of the matrix, and you have kind of high skill, high will, low skill, low will, and you can sort of match the approach to use and tell people what to do if the chips are down and there's just a really straightforward instruction to be carried out. But actually, if you want people to think for themselves, if you want people to be motivated to do things when you're not there, you have to ask questions and allow people to process things in their own way if they can. And that used to be seen as a soft skill, and as I say, I don't think it is anymore. I think people recognise that to get really high levels of productivity, you've got to tune into what people want and need. It's not a nice to have, it's an absolutely definite must do.
Yeah, we were always told that tell is one of the first on the spectrum of coaching.
Yeah.
So like anything, you've got to pick your your time to be direct, you've got to pick your time to be softer. And different people, as we talked about, react to different things. So some people react a lot better to tell or deliver better, and some want the softer side and the more thinking around it.
Yeah.
It's really sorry, go on.
I was going to say I probably came to those conclusions earlier on because I'm appalling at being told what to do. So I guess I learned from my own experiences of coming up with lots of excuses to why what somebody had told me what to do wasn't a good idea. And when I understood the psychology and the neuroscience why, I actually understood why actually I'd not always been very well behaved when I'd been on the receiving end of an instruction. So kind of made me feel better about life at that stage.
But some of that must come back to the kind of barriers that companies face when trying to implement large change scale or change people's habits.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've done lots of change programs. In my later days, I was head of corporate HR and I was responsible for lots of big, complex change programs. And the bottom line is that most change will fail because people just don't want to change. And people will find some amazing excuses not to change. And this is even when there are really compelling reasons to change. So change can be really in your own interest and your brain is wired to not do it. So my favourite but very sad research project on this, I'm just getting the book now. In fact, it's one that's never far from me. It's called Immunity to Change by Keegan and Leahy, if any of your listeners want to look it up. But they got a study, it was done at Harvard, that showed that when doctors told heart patients they'd die if they didn't change their habits, only 1 in 7 people could follow through successfully. So desire and motivation aren't enough, even when it's literally a matter of life or death. So our ability to change is elusive, even when we've got a really good reason to do it. And there's lots and lots of neuroscientific reasons why that's the case. But as a leader, even without reading any of that, if you just understand that people fundamentally don't want to change something because it's time intensive for your brain to create that new instruction manual that we spoke about earlier, your brain really doesn't want to do that. So it comes up with some really good excuses to stop you doing it. In fact, should we do a quick experiment? I think I've done this one with you before, but it does work, I think, on a podcast. So if you fold your arms, Simon.
Yeah.
And if you now fold the other way.
Yes, I struggle with it.
Right over left before and left over right now. Tell me about the difference between the two.
One, my brain struggles to get it the other way around. It just feels weird. It feels unnatural. It feels awkward, strange. Yeah, it's all those bits that immediately made me want to stop doing it and do it the other way or not do it.
Absolutely. And there's no reason whatsoever why you couldn't learn to do it the other way. It's simply that your brain doesn't want to. And what it'll be doing is telling you it's weird and strange and uncomfortable, when it's not really any of those things. It's not uncomfortable, it just feels odd. And the trick to helping people with change is that simple, that you have to accept that their brain will tell them to unfold their arms the weird way and go back to doing it the other way when you're not there. You have to accept that is true of people, and you have to help them to get used to folding their arms the wrong way through regular practice and finding out what's in it for them. But then accepting that you've got to get a bit deeper, because telling somebody that it's good for them and therefore they're just going to do it just doesn't work, like in that example of the heart patient, sadly.
But it's interesting because we don't, as retailers, and that's the background I grew up with, I suspect it's the same in hospitality, we don't plan for, I won't say failure, we don't plan for non-adoption, or we don't plan for that change being a gradual thing. It's almost, because these are very project-driven things, productivity reviews and staff planning and what have you, it's almost, well, the project ends here. Everyone must have understood it and done it by then. There's no gradually managing it or circling back round. It's kind of normally devolved to the field teams to their own.
Absolutely. And is it therefore fair to say that people are then surprised when they visit the retail store and people aren't still doing the thing that they were supposed to be doing when they changed it?
Oh, absolutely. Because the field manager, regional manager, area manager, whatever, has probably got different priorities as well. So you then back to what's important to my boss becomes important to me, because that alignment needs to be in place. So that other stuff goes in the too difficult box, or it'll be gone in 6 months, or it's flavour of the month. You hear all those phrases.
Yeah.
or we've done it before, we'll do it again, or last time we did it, it never worked. All those negative connotations that our brain's telling us that's okay to leave it, because guess what? It was never going to work anyway.
And it's all of those excuses are simply that your arm folding feels weird, but just made sound more like what a grown-up would say about a work project. The science is the same. It's simply your brain coming up with excuses because you just don't want to do it, because it takes up too much energy. So if you take the one of, oh, we always did it that way, and therefore there's no real point in doing it, that really does quite sound like the arm foldy thing when you think about it. And the only way for somebody to get used to doing it the new way is in some cases to be forced to do it the new way until it doesn't feel weird anymore. And there's not really any shortcuts around that. And I think you raise a really good point that when you've got area managers implementing things, it can be really difficult because they're just not there to make sure it gets done. So they've got to find ways to motivate people to do things that are different when they're not there insisting that it happens that way. And I've seen that loads of time firsthand. And in some ways, that's where I became fascinated with human behaviour. I became fascinated when I started to wonder, probably as an area manager, if I'm thinking back, why is it that people are not doing things when I'm not there? And that's horrible to think about. You start to think about yourself as a bit of a failure as a leader. But once you accept that that's the norm, you can do something really quite smart with that, as opposed to covering that over yourself as a leader because you think, oh gosh, my people aren't doing it, I must be doing something wrong. Well, my people aren't doing it when I'm not there is the norm. So once you accept that that's the norm, you can start to do some really interesting things to get around it. But you've got to accept the norm first, not hide.
Yeah, and it's difficult, isn't it, to reflect on yourself as well and come up with those, considerations about how you could be different or better, or how you're not behaving in a way that some people get, because that's part of it. The interesting story I always talk about in terms of changing behaviours is counting stock when it's received on a delivery. Yeah. So the amount of organisations we work with, and they say, oh yeah, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we stopped counting stock in at the back door, and all you do now is you scan the pallet, you scan the crate, you scan the tote box, and we know what's in it. Oh, great. We save loads of time doing that. We'll go into a store, and 5 out of 10 stores will see them checking it. And they're checking it because, 7, 8, 10 years ago, they lost 3 paintbrushes and 2 tins of paint that they were and were charged for. But they want to be clear that they're not losing stuff. The best examples of, I suppose, forced change to a degree are when it's forced through tech. So the button you used to press is removed, so you physically can't do it. You've got a very painful curve at the start, but actually by taking away the ability, it forces the new rhythm and routine.
It does. And do you know the bit I'd layer on that is, you mentioned it earlier, is it's what the line manager pays attention to. So do you know what? If they've got a line manager who's still saying, do you know what, where did those 3 paintbrushes go? They will pay attention to making sure they don't lose 3 paintbrushes. Where if that line manager is really making no big deal at all about 3 paintbrushes, because in the scheme of things, your time is much better spent thinking about how to grow the sales in the business. That's what people will focus their attention on. So I always encourage leaders to talk about the things that are actually the most important, because we can sometimes forget how much that makes people do or not do something. If you're going into retail business and you are focusing on, oh, have you lost 3 paintbrushes? Even just mentioning it, because you hold the keys to people's reward and their benefits and whether they get fired or not. So all those extrinsic things, people will do what you say that is important, even if you've previously told them it's something else. They really pay attention to those things that you say are important. So as leaders, it's really important that if you're changing something, you talk about the new stuff, and you almost really, but again, for you, it's like folding your arms. You've got to really resist going back and checking on the 3 paintbrushes, because if you are always checking on 3 paintbrushes, people will always check that 3 haven't gone missing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the fact that you've spent 10 quid in labour for 4 quid of paintbrushes has gone out the window, but that's logic.
Yeah, because they want to impress you as their boss. We've all grown up like that. Most of us want to impress our parents to start with, then our teachers, and then it becomes our boss. And it's not just impressing them, it's about they hold the keys to our future success. So we have to be, I'm always really conscious as a parent about what I pay attention to, because you do have to be really careful that if you're not careful, you can get your kids to pay attention to things that are your equivalent of 10 hours labour for £4 a paintbrush.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's been a fantastic chat, Dulcie. For me, the key things I've learned are around not underestimating the work required to embed the change. So it's easier to identify the opportunities and build the roadmap and look at the ways of doing things. We shouldn't assume that everybody will jump on board at the same speed, in the same way, using the same materials to do that.
Yeah.
And also the whole leadership piece is key, whether it's in a store, in a restaurant, in a pub, in an office, and then that whole level above, because they cast the shadow of what's important. And if that's not in line with kind of corporate, then people are going to focus on very different things.
Yeah, 100%. And I'd agree with that as a really good summary. You might have the best or the right optimum levels of productivity, but if people aren't motivated to hit the targets, and if their bosses aren't talking about those things all the time, particularly if it's a new target or a new way of working, it will fail, and people are surprised when it fails. But really, we shouldn't be. We should be surprised when people change, remembering the arm folding thing, rather than surprised when they don't.
Absolutely. So if people want to find you, Dulcie, you're on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. My website's probably the best place to find me. So that's toprightThinking.com, and that's based on that 4-box grid. And you can buy the books on there. You can find me on there for coaching or for training. It's probably the easiest way to find me.
Brilliant. And we'll put a link when this podcast goes live, so people will just be able to click on the link and find it. And finally, we're asking everybody one question that comes on the podcast.
Go on.
So you're on the spot now. So what's the best bit of business advice you've ever been given?
Oh, gosh. Learn to listen better, Dulcie. That's it.
It's good. I think I could probably heed from that at times. Yeah. My listening probably isn't as good as it should be. Sometimes saying less is saying more, isn't it?
Yeah, I had to go and train to be listened. So, a lot of my coaching training at Henley was in really listening to what people are saying, because we can hear stuff, can't we? But I was great at hearing what I wanted to hear and then going, right, come on then, let's do it, without actually hearing that underneath the yes, people actually were going, oh no, I'm a bit unsure actually. So I've learnt over the years that even yes doesn't always mean yes. It might mean actually I'm feeling a little bit worried about that. So by listen, I mean listen under what people are saying. And that's stood me in such good stead since I actually learnt to do it properly.
I appreciate you coming on.
Look
after yourself.
Yeah, take care.